Our scripture lesson this morning comes from the writing of St. Paul, the church in Corinth, Corinthians chapter 2. As you know, we're in a series about footsteps to follow in this coming year. And we've been looking at Paul's writings to the churches in the early church. And we've been looking at summaries of what he says. You have before you a summary of this text. And for those who are online subsequent to this worship service, it will be found as a drop down in our list. Paul's letter to the Corinthian church. The church in Corinth is one of the few churches that still exist today that was started in the time of St. Paul. The city of Corinth is still there. It's in a different location from what it was 2,000 years ago because of an earthquake in the 19th century. It was pretty much destroyed, the ancient city was, and they moved the city of Corinth, Greece, some 5 miles away, but the city's still there. And Paul had established a church in Corinth and had written back to the church at least 4 letters. And we believe, theologians and archaeologists believe, that 3 of those letters are combined in what we know of as 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Now, Paul writes to them, and it's a church that's divided. And he talks to them about instructions on how to come together. And in the midst of the struggle, he says, be happy, be content, find peace. You won't separate all the differences, but find some way to work together. And if you know Paul's writings, in a very unique portion of this second letter of Corinthians in chapter 12, Paul does something very personally reflective and unusual for his writings. And that's the text we look at today. It begins with chapter 11. In chapter 11, Paul starts in his letter to the Corinthian church. He says, I don't consider myself as second rate in any way compared to those super apostles. Now, Paul was battling throughout his ministry, and I hope you're watching the scripture as we're reading through it. Paul was battling throughout his ministry with the first generation church down in Jerusalem, Peter, James, and John. They were always saying, you're not really an apostle, you're not one of us because you didn't know Jesus in his earthly ministry. And Paul's saying, I was chosen by God, I met Jesus on the road to Damascus. It was in a spiritual sense, but I know him, and I'm not going to be put in a second place to you first generation super apostles. Verse 6, though, in chapter 11 says, but even if I'm uneducated in public speaking, and I'm not without knowledge because of what I've learned. Now he begins a diatribe, beginning in verse 22, of comparisons with himself and these people in Jerusalem. You don't have it in the text, let me share it with you. Paul says, by the way, are these super apostles Hebrew? Well, so am I. Are they Israelites? Well, so am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Jesus Christ? So am I. And then he goes on to say, look, if you want to compare me to these other apostles, let me just tell you, I've been in prison more than they have. By the way, it's the only time in Christian ministry that I know of that your prison record is something to brag about. But he says, I've been in prison more than you have. I've been stoned. I've been shipwrecked. I've spent day and night in an open sea. I have been on rivers. I've been robbed. I've been to the Gentiles. I've been all over. Basically saying, I've done as much as you have. And he said, I have faced these dangers of hardship and hard labor, many sleepless nights, hunger and thirst without food, and in cold without enough clothes. And basically, Paul is saying, look, if you want to compare me to these people, I can stand up to the comparison, Paul writes. And then he comes around to this unique passage in his writings, chapter 12. Look with me as I read. Then Paul says, is it necessary for me to brag, to self-promote? Not that it does any good. Doesn't help anything. If I did want to brag, I would not be foolish because I would be telling the truth. I'm holding back from bragging, Paul writes, so that no one will give me any more credit than what anyone has heard or seen about me. And now here's the crux of the matter. Verse 7. Paul says, I have been given a thorn. It's like a stake in my side. It's a sharp affliction in my body. Because of these outstanding understandings and revelations I've had, I have received so that I would not be conceited. In other words, he's saying that this affliction he has is something God has allowed him to have to keep him from being conceited. He says, it is a messenger from Satan sent to torment, to mistreat harshly me, so that I won't be conceited. I pleaded, Paul writes. I urgently prayed and called and besieged God. I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that this affliction might leave me. But the Lord said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, because my power is made perfect in your weakness. So I, Paul writes, would gladly I will gladly spend my time bragging about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. Therefore, he writes to that church and to this church, therefore I am all right with all my weaknesses, all my insults, all my disasters, all my harassments, and the stressful situations for which the sake of Christ, because when I am weak, that is when I'm strong. This is the word of the Lord.